Welcome to Current Evidence for Workplace-Based Interventions on Return to Work for MSK, Pain-Related and Mental Health Conditions, a Systematic Review Update. We're glad you're here. My name is Angie Hunt, Project Manager with the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC Government, as well as donations and memberships to CIRPD. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You will be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they are available. As I mentioned, my name is Angie and I'll be moderating the webinar and Q&A session. Our presenters today are Kim Cullen and Emma Irvin. Dr. Kim Cullen is an Associate Scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. Cullen holds a PhD in biophysics at the University of Guelph and an MSc in clinical rehabilitation science from McMaster University. She's also a registered kinesiologist in Ontario with an extensive clinical expertise in the delivery of disability management services to injured workers. Her work has focused on work disability prevention with a particular interest in return-to-work support for both musculoskeletal disorders and mental health conditions. Her current research activities at IWH include work in systematic reviews and synthesis of research evidence concerning effective workplace policies and practices in return to work, as well as the development of research protocols to evaluate the effectiveness of policy and program innovation in return to work in the Ontario Disability Prevention System. Emma Irvin is the Director of Research Operations at the Institute for Work and Health, where she oversees research planning, research operations, information systems, and the internal library. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Ontario. Irvin also oversees the Systematic Review Program at IWH, one of the Institute's key research programs. Her research focuses on the methodology and conduct of literature reviews, from scoping to systematic. And now I'll hand over the presentation to Emma.
Thank you, Angie. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for our colleagues who are out west. And so, as Angie said, Kim and I are going to give a presentation on the current evidence for workplace-based interventions on return to work for musculoskeletal, pain-related, and mental health conditions, which is both an update of a previous systematic review that the Institute for Work and Health did, and also a bit of a broader scope, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So we had as you can see, we had quite a large research team, which was just terrific. We had a number of individuals at the Institute for Work and Health in Ontario, and we were also joined and in fact funded by colleagues at ISCRR in Australia. We had a colleague at the University of Montreal in Quebec, and we also had a colleague from Norway. And this team, obviously, as you can see, we had a number of languages, but we also were able to have a lot of different disciplines, which is one of the things that we feel is quite important at the Institute for Work and Health, is to have a broad disciplinary team and also as many jurisdictional representatives as possible. We also, one of the other things that is important to us at the Institute is to have large stakeholder representation. As you can see, we have a number of stakeholders on this review, which really we feel does benefit all of our systematic reviews because their input at a number of stages, which I'll get into, is quite invaluable. Our stakeholders on this review are our prevention system partners. So our prevention system here in Ontario, we had representatives from the Workplace Safety Insurance Board and a number of our health and safety associations. We had representatives from workplace parties, we had injured worker advocates, representation from labour, disability management consultants, and also a private insurer. The objective of this review was to provide an overview of a systematic review and update on the effectiveness of workplace-based return to work and disability management support interventions for musculoskeletal, pain-related disorders, and mental health conditions. You'll notice here that the words workplace-based are highlighted, and that is in part because that is the focus of the original review, but in this review we also broadened it and are doing another review on systems-based interventions. The other thing that was unique about this update is that we included mental health conditions which were not a focus of the original review. And the outcomes that we were looking at were return to work outcomes, specifically duration, work functioning, and costs. The rationale for the update is that we have found throughout our the other reviews that the Institute for Work and Health has done is that the literature in our field is growing. And one of the things that's really quite exciting is not only is there a growing literature, but we find that the quality of that literature is also becoming stronger, which is very exciting for us. We felt that it was important to update this evidence because it is obviously a priority for our area, and we're recognizing that there was an increased awareness of the importance to look at mental health within this domain. And hopefully we can all agree that we feel that it's quite important, where possible, to have up-to-date recommendations based on the most current evidence that is available. And to that point, as you can see, this is the a part of the a focus of our Workplace Safety and Insurance Board in their strategic plan, the most recent strategic plan. So the steps that we undertake at the Institute for Work and Health, the Institute for Work and Health does house the Cochrane Back and Neck Group, and we have housed that review group since the mid-90s. And so we started off conducting Cochrane reviews, but in the area of occupational health and safety in the field, the other area that we work in, we are finding that the Cochrane methodology at that point in time, which is 20 years ago now, we needed to adapt the Cochrane methods for the population studies that we were examining. As you can imagine, it was at that time very hard to find a randomized controlled trial in this field, et cetera, and it's not clinical based, which is the where Cochrane started. So, however, having said all that, we did adapt or adopt the Cochrane methodology and then adapt it for our own needs, and you can see that it's quite similar approach. So the first step is to develop a question, second is to then conduct the literature search, third is to then do a relevance, an examination of the relevance of the pool of articles that we've retrieved from our search for the research question that we've developed, to look at the quality of that pool of studies, to extract the data, and then conduct an evidence synthesis. As I mentioned a few slides ago, we feel very strongly at the Institute that it is very important to engage with our stakeholder community, the stakeholders being defined as those individuals who are most involved in the research question that we would develop with them. And so we have been involving our stakeholders since about 2002. As you can see, we involve them in a number of stages along the review process. One is in actually determining a topic that we would start to examine, to develop a research question with them. We then have our stakeholders be part of an input meeting, which is where we would ask them for terms for our literature search, for databases to look at as part of our search, because what we're very concerned about, which is why we like to have a very large team where possible representing multidisciplines and multi-jurisdictions, is to ensure that we cast our net as broadly as possible so that we're not missing a pool of literature and thereby potentially bringing in bias into our process. So our stakeholders are very, very useful at that. Our stakeholders are also invaluable in helping us around developing our relevance criteria, which we map onto our research question, which we've also developed with them, Occasionally, we have a stakeholder as part of our review team. That is rare because of the time that it takes to undertake a review. And then we have our stakeholders come back at the end of the process to ensure that our report or our paper or our findings are as clear and as transparent as possible. It's very important here. One of the tenets of our review program is that no matter what we have done, it is transparent and you understand how we got to our findings. One of the bonuses that we have found, one of the many bonuses of engaging with stakeholders, is to have them involved in the dissemination of our evidence, which has been very, very helpful. For the purposes of this webinar, so that I don't take you through too much of the methods and delay you from getting to the exciting findings, which Kim is going to talk about, I'm just going to address 3 of the steps in our process. I've already talked to you and already given you the research question, but step number 3 was the relevance or inclusion criteria. What were the pool of studies that we would include and do a title and abstract screening on? So the study had to be an intervention study, it had to be workplace-based, there needed to be a comparison group, and it needed to be looking at return to work or disability management support. This is this sort of a bit unwieldy algorithm is something that we've also developed with our stakeholder community. So I'm just going to take you through this very quickly. And so one of the things that we look at when we have already looked at those articles that have met our relevance, we have examined the quality of them, and then we assign through the quality assessment process, the pool of studies gets divided into either high, medium, or low quality studies. We only look at those studies that have met the criteria of being either medium or high quality. And as you can see, high is defined as over 85% in our quality assessment tool, and medium is 50 to 85%. So we look at that pool of studies that have met that quality, and then we look at the quantity that we have of those studies. So this is developed, this is an algorithm that is using a best evidence synthesis approach. So we've got the quality, we've got the quantity, and then we have the consistency of the studies. How many of the studies are looking agree across the pool that we're left with. So the piece that we're very excited by is that with our stakeholder community, we worked with them so that we would develop the words on the left-hand column where it says level of evidence. So those are the words strong, moderate, limited, and mixed, and insufficient. We did meet with the stakeholder community, with about 76 different stakeholders to agree upon this terminology, so that a strong level of evidence had a minimum quality of high quality studies, a minimum of 3 high quality studies, whereby 3 of the high studies agreed. If there were more than 3, then 3/4 of the medium and high quality studies agreed. So that word strong, moderate, limited, mixed, and insufficient we developed with our research partners, our stakeholders. And then on the right-hand side, the strength of the messages that we would develop as a result of this pool of studies. So where we had a strong level of evidence, the message would be that we would be recommending something. Where there is a moderate level of evidence, the message would be where we would suggest practice considerations. And the other thing our stakeholders wanted us to do is where we had limited, mixed, or insufficient, we used to have that box blank, and they encourage us to just say that there was not enough evidence to make recommendations or practice considerations. So now I'm going to turn this over to Kim, where she will describe or give you the exciting findings of this review.
Okay, thank you. So while Emma just changes the screen, I'll just do a sound check. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, Emma, for starting us off, and thank you, Angie, for the invitation to come and speak of the research funding. findings, and thank you to all of you in attendance today and those of you who may listen after on the webcast. We are pleased to be able to share the findings from this recent project. And Emma has given you the overview of the methods of the project, and I'm going to walk you through now what we found from the start to the finish. So what you see on the slide here on the left-hand side are the 6 steps of the review that Emma briefly went over in her part of the presentation. You can see our question at the top, the different electronic databases that we searched for the, sorry, I'm just realizing that that should be better. I had a pop-up blocking half the slide. The different databases that we looked at to retrieve studies, and then the most important takeaway findings are that you can see when we started the review, after we removed all the duplicate citations across those databases, we start with a number that is around 8,898 studies that we needed to look at. And in the end, once we walked our way through the steps of review, finding ones that met our inclusion criteria, praising the quality and removing any that were of low quality, and then getting to the data extraction step, for synthesis, you can see that we end up with 36 studies. The 36 studies can be further subdivided into 2 categories, those that represent musculoskeletal disorders or pain conditions, and those that represent mental health interventions. So those are what those 2 acronyms you see on the screen represent there. The first thing that we did was to look at the different types of studies across the 36 papers and identify the types of interventions that were applied in this literature. And we found 12 different types of interventions that were tried. Remember, you'll recall this is workplace-based, so things that workplace parties can lead themselves or they can acquire the services of to help support workers in their return to work. And when we first identified these 12 intervention types, we wondered whether we might be able to put them into classification buckets. Could we identify particular buckets that represent these different components? And we were able to do that. We were able to identify 3 different buckets. In this case, we used the jargon domains to represent those buckets. And we realized that we had a cluster of interventions that were focused on the health and improving the health of the worker, a cluster that were focused on coordination of services, and a cluster that were focused on work modifications. And this is the breakdown of what those types of what the interventions look like. So under health focus, you can see that we had things like cognitive behavioral therapy, work hardening, graded activity, training for physicians on how to give an occupational-based therapy, and what we classified as multi-component health-focused interventions, which meant that within this yellow sphere, there may have been more than one intervention that was applied, but it all belonged to trying to improve the health of the worker. Under coordination of services, we identified things that look like return to work planning and coordination, case management efforts, and worker education and training. And we placed worker education and training in this sphere because the training that was being offered in the intervention was focused on how to help the worker manage the system, how to get from the point of being off work to understanding what their responsibilities were along the path to return to work. And the final domain or sphere is work modification, and that included work accommodation offers, and those represented pretty much any type of work accommodation offer you might think of. They could be a graded hours program, they could be a change in the nature of the job that you're doing, so you're in a modified duty assignment, it could be addition of supports or accommodation devices to help you sustain your work. And the different studies included multiple different ways that work accommodations were offered. And supervisor education and training is also in this domain because the intervention, or the one study that looked at supervisor education and training focused on providing training for supervisors to support and identify acceptable work accommodation offers for the workers that were returning after injury. So if you're doing the math, you can see that I've said there are 12 different types of interventions, and really all I have listed here are 10. And that is because we also identified 2 types of domains that we classified as multi-domain interventions. We separated out multi-domain interventions that were focused on musculoskeletal disorders and those that were focused on mental health. But what we saw throughout the literature was that there were a number of studies that had intervention components that belonged in more than one of these domains. And in fact, if I show you the breakdown of the studies, what you're seeing on the screen now, the numbers represent, they total 36. So I had mentioned earlier we had 36 studies. And the numbers here are telling you how many studies would be classified into each of these domains. And by far and away, you can see that most of the studies, 21 of the 36 studies, are represented in what we classified as multi-domain. So they either included 2 or primarily 3 of those different intervention categories in their intervention. Turning our attention to the outcomes that we captured in this review, we were interested in how workplace-based interventions can support and improve return to work. And we identified 3 different outcomes that represented improvement in return to work. The first one is what you would traditionally think of as lost time or days away from work. So do these interventions help reduce the number of days absence that workers have from the time of the injury or the episode of disability until they're back at work? And those were classified in a number of different ways, and some of them you can see here on the screen. The second type of outcome that we found in this literature are things that we classified as work functioning. So this was after people came back to work, measures that were assessing workers' function in the workplace. So measures of work limitations, productive working hours, etc. And the final category of outcomes that relate to return to work were on costs. Had these interventions been evaluated for cost effectiveness? Did they have merit in terms of reducing the duration of disability costs, such as income replacement and total costs of compensation? We separated out, and we didn't look into studies that only looked at the cost of the intervention itself. We primarily focused on the types of costs that would reduce the burden associated with the time away from work. So looking just a little farther at those 3 outcomes, here's a slide that shows you the number of studies that had included each of those 3 different types of outcomes. You'll recall that there are 36 studies in total. So 34 of the 36 studies included a measure of lost time or days away from work. Only 8 studies included a measure of work functioning after people had returned to work. And 14 of the 36 studies had looked at the costs associated with the time away from work and whether the intervention helped to reduce that burden. If I was to show you what this slide looked like from the original review, which we published in 2005, the picture would look different. At that time, there were no studies that had looked at work functioning. And I think this is, although it's not ideal to see so few studies now thinking about how well workers are functioning once they return to work, I think it's a glass half full stage where in the last decade we've seen attention being placed on this area of interest, and that was something that was missing when we did the original review a decade ago. Okay, so this is the moment you really all tuned in to find out what is the effectiveness of these interventions and how do they help return to work. So I'm going to break this down into the multi-domain interventions and then the individual components. And what we found, first of all, is that regardless of whether the intervention was aimed at musculoskeletal disorders or mental health conditions, the multi-domain interventions, those are the ones that would be represented in the dark navy blue in the sphere at the top left there, where they include at least 2 and more often all 3 types of intervention components, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that these multi-component interventions are effective for improving return to work. So you see here that we have strong evidence. That language comes from the slide Emma showed you earlier on our algorithm. Strong evidence means that there were at least 3 studies focused on that type of intervention that were deemed of high quality, and the agreement was at least 75% or higher. So these interventions help to reduce work disability duration or lost time. They also, we find moderate levels of evidence that they improve work functioning. And for mental health, we see strong levels of evidence, and for musculoskeletal disorders, we see moderate levels of evidence that these interventions also help to reduce disability costs. So multi-component interventions are very successful at helping injured workers navigate that transition back to work after a period of absence. If we look at the single domain intervention, so that would be within the yellow sphere or the blue sphere or the red sphere, the picture's a little different. So graded activity programs, which were considered a health-focused intervention, and work accommodations, which were considered a work modification intervention, there is moderate levels of evidence that these 2 interventions, if offered singly all on their own, can help to reduce lost time away from work after an injury for musculoskeletal disorders. In terms of cognitive behavioral therapy, there is an interesting pattern that emerged out of the literature. So you can see here, for cognitive behavioral therapy, we have written down without a focus on workplace solutions. Those types of interventions do not help reduce the time away from work. There are strong levels of evidence that traditional cognitive behavioral therapy programs do not necessarily improve return to work. There is evidence that they do improve return to work when the focus is on workplace solutions. So thinking about what a cognitive behavioral therapy program looks like, it is traditionally something that is a therapeutic intervention between a client, or in this case the worker, and a clinician. And the focus is on trying to identify potential problems and coming up with skills and strategies to meet those issues. And the programs themselves are quite successful at improving in recovery of symptoms, but we were interested in whether or not they helped with return to work. And the literature was very clear that when the therapy, when cognitive behavioral therapy is focused on identifying problems related to work, related to making that transition from being off work to being back at work, and the problems were then identified and the therapist and client worked on strategies and skills in order to solve those dilemmas, they were effective at helping return to work. But when they were traditional programs where it was just think about things that you need to solve and there was no focus or lens placed on identifying those issues specifically related to the workplace, the literature is showing that while they improve recovery, they do not help to improve return to work. And then the remainder of those single domain interventions, you'll recall that we had 12 different types of interventions, and on this screen you really only see 5 represented. So the other 7 interventions that we identified in this body of literature, we classified them as limited or insufficient or mixed evidence that these interventions have an effect on our return to work outcomes. So all 3 of them, whether it was costs, disability duration, or work functioning. So tying everything together then, if we turn our attention to where we were when we did this systematic review in 2005, and that represented all of the literature in this area from 1990 to 2005, the findings that you see on the screen right now represent what our key messages out of that original review were. That we understood at that time that both lost time and the costs associated with time away from work could be improved by these following items: work accommodation offers, contact between healthcare providers in the workplace, early contact with the worker by the workplace, ergonomic worksite visits, and the presence of a return to work coordinator. And now what we're seeing is a different pattern that's emerging. If we introduce the literature that's been conducted over the last decade, we're really seeing that while those 5 pieces are still in the literature, that it's something synergistic about the way they're offered that has the largest impact on these outcomes. That when offered individually, except for work accommodation offers, everything on this slide on the left would not have met our criteria to help guide practice. And instead what we're seeing is these pieces all work best in these multi-domain and comprehensive interventions. And most single component interventions really do have limited to no effect on the outcomes of return to work. So let's turn our attention to where we are with these findings now. So we have published these findings in a peer-reviewed journal, in the Journal of Occupational Rehabilitation. And the peer-reviewed manuscript is actually available free and open access. And I've placed the link here on this slide. If you were to click on this link, or even just to Google Journal of Occupational Rehabilitation and type my name and Emma's name into that search string, you would find this article, and it's free download for anyone. So you don't need to have a subscription to the journal in order to access the article. So you can see the full peer-reviewed paper. We also at the Institute for Work and Health have done a more lay-friendly version of this manuscript in our At Work article that was available in winter of 2017. It was part of our January issue 87, and that's available off of the Institute for Work and Health's website at the following link. So if you're interested in reading a summary of the peer review paper, you can do that at this link. And we're also now in the early stages of thinking through other strategies that we can share these findings. Our communications team at the Institute for Work and Health has worked with us to develop a 1-minute short video. We call these video cards or short videos that are shareable. So these are things that someone might want to share on social media to their networks or to their clients. And I'm going to play that now. I'm not sure how well it will work on the webinar, but the link for it, it's up on YouTube. You can see it at the bottom of the screen if it doesn't function perfectly for us now. Okay, so that is that video. There is actually music playing in the background of that music, but I understand that the sound didn't come through, so I apologize for that. But this certainly is something that we are just at the early stages of working to share and use as one strategy to help get our findings out for use. Where we're at right now in terms of our next steps, this, as Emma mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation, this particular series of key findings that we shared today are part of a larger project. We are also looking at synthesizing what the qualitative literature says about these types of interventions and their success in return to work. And that project right now is nearing completion. One of our scientists who is part of this project, Ulrich, who is our colleague from Norway, he is the lead on that project, and we are hoping to be able to capture more of the nuances of what it is about these interventions that make them successful for this type of, for return to work. And also, we are just now getting started on system-based interventions. So these would be jurisdictional level interventions, things that compensation authorities may be putting in place that workplaces need to adhere to, and what those strategies look like for helping return to work. And that has just recently been funded, and we expect that project to be getting started just nearing the end of the summer. And the idea is then that we'll have a much more comprehensive understanding of what interventions can help workers transition from a period of absence back to work, both from within workplaces and across a larger scale in jurisdictional type interventions. The qualitative literature will help inform us as to what it is about those particular interventions that are the most important concepts to get right if you were going to introduce these interventions. These are our final acknowledgements. Of course, Emma mentioned earlier that financial support for this particular project was from our colleagues at ISCRR, the Institute for Safety and Compensation Recovery Research. And of course, Emma and I are both from the Institute for Work and Health, which is funded by the province of Ontario. And we are acknowledging that the findings we're sharing today are those of the research team and perhaps not necessarily reflecting those of the province of Ontario. And that is the end of our slide series, so we can turn now to questions you may have. If you wanted to reach either Emma or I, you can reach us. These are our email addresses here. I'll leave that up for a moment. But there are other ways that you can interact with us as well, and that would be if you were interested in receiving our monthly e-alerts or newsletters, you could sign up for those on our website, and then you could also follow us on our various social media platforms and our YouTube channel as well, which is where that video I just showed you has been posted.
Well, thank you very much. Now, to our audience, if you have any questions, please enter them into the question and answer box on the GoToWebinar panel. Some questions that came in. How was the determination made for the quality of the studies that were reviewed? Were there specific criteria?
Yep, there were specific criteria. Emma, do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to speak to that?
Go ahead. I have it right here, so if you want to go ahead, I can jump in.
Okay, sounds good. So we did have a very detailed, oh, my memory is failing, was it 26 items? I have forgotten how many items.
26.
Oh, my memory isn't as bad as I thought. 26 item series of questions that have been developed over time and are based partly on the Cochrane risk of bias tool and also previous well-validated instruments for appraising quality in intervention research. And we look for things like the bias, the potential areas where there are risks that could influence the findings. So we often talk about that as credibility. Can we rely on the fact that the individual studies, the findings they found are really related and can be attributed to the intervention, or whether there may be other issues at play that could influence those. And the things that are interesting there are how the sample is recruited, whether or not it's a randomized sample, or whether there could be some biases within the particular sample itself. We're interested in things about ability to control for confounding or co-interventions, other things that may be outside of the intervention that was being offered, but that could influence the outcomes of interest. And also the way the statistics were done. So do they show an effect when effect is there, or have there been any reporting issues where it may be selective reporting and then therefore you're not sure that you can trust the findings at play? So I think that was the question. Hopefully it was. That's the answer I gave you. Emma, anything you wanted to add to that?
The only other thing, as Kim mentioned, the quality appraisal tool was each of the questions were mapped into the domains of risk of bias, and so we did undertake a risk of bias as well as assessing it using the IWH quality tool as well.
Okay. Another question that came through, in your findings, were there any interventions that stuck out as being most successful in the return to work process?
I think that's a great question. The most successful interventions were, of course, those multi-domain interventions. And I'm just flipping now to a slide. Hopefully this is coming up on your screen.
Yeah, it looks good, Kim.
Thank you. So, of course, this is from an earlier version of the presentation where we didn't use yellow for the health focus. On this screen, you see it's green. It's not any different than the yellow. It just hasn't been changed. But here what you're seeing, each of the rows represent the actual studies that were multi-component or multi-domain studies. And you can see where the check marks are, which were the components that were most often used. And where on the left you see it says 15, those would be the studies that included at least one from all three domains. And here you can see just by visually glancing that quite often, in terms of focus on the health of the worker, there were many things, multi-component pieces that were at play there. Return to work planning and help with education for the worker were important regarding coordination of services. And for work modifications, primarily almost all of these studies had some form of work accommodation. So those could have looked like change in working hours, a gradual return regarding hours, or giving modified assignment or different duties, or any kind of accommodation supports.
Okay, another question that came through. When the studies were reviewed, did you find any patterns in the employers in terms of how return to work programs work to help workers?
I'm not sure I quite understand that question.
Was it in terms of the sectors or?
Yeah, patterns within the employers. Does that mean what type of industry they were, or?
Let me have the speaker or the question. In the sectors or industry.
Okay. Good question. There were a number of different industries captured throughout the series of studies, and I would say, Emma can correct me if she disagrees, but that there wasn't one particular industry that seemed to stand out as a gold star industry. Really and truly, there were studies conducted in offices. There was a study conducted in a mine. There were many material handling type jobs that would involve manual lifting, manufacturing settings.
Yeah, there is public administration, professional, scientific, and technical services, mining, construction, agriculture, manufacturing, transportation, healthcare and social assistance, educational services, hospitality and other services, and other. And it was fairly evenly distributed. The only sort of peaks were in manufacturing, where we had 10, and healthcare and social services, where we had 17. All the others were less than 5. 5 or less, sorry, if that's helpful.
Okay, great. I think that concludes the questions for now. Emma and Kim, do you have anything you'd like to add as we conclude your presentation?
Other than thank you, I don't have anything. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Yes, and thank you for your presentation.